They removed him from the plane in front of 200 passengers. They said he didn't belong there. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that without him, that plane wasn't going anywhere. 100 people sat in their seats that Tuesday morning, scrolling through phones, adjusting pillows, ordering drinks, completely unaware that the man being escorted up the aisle in front of them was the only reason any of them were going to make it to Seattle alive. They saw a well-dressed black man being removed from first class. They saw a gate agent with a clipboard. They saw what they expected to see. They didn't see the 11,000 flight hours. They didn't see the 14 years. They didn't see the storms he had landed through, the emergencies he had managed at 37,000 feet, the lives he had held in his hands so many times that steadiness had become not just a skill, but a way of being. They saw a man who, in their estimation, didn't belong. They were wrong, and they were about to find out exactly how wrong. Stay with us, because this story isn't just about one man on one plane. It's about what happens when the world decides who you are before you ever open your mouth, and what it looks like when the truth walks through the door anyway. The alarm on Marcus Washington's phone went off at 4:47 a.m., the same as it had every working morning for the past 14 years. He didn't need it anymore. His body had long since learned to wake on its own at 4:45, 2 minutes before the sound, as if even in sleep some part of him remained on schedule. But he kept the alarm anyway. His father had taught him that rituals matter, that the small disciplines are the ones that hold everything else together. He silenced it before the second buzz and swung his legs over the side of the bed. In the darkness of his Atlanta apartment, the city outside his window was still mostly asleep. A few car lights moved silently along the street below. The sky was the deep, particular blue that comes just before dawn. Not black, not gray, but something in between that Marcus had always loved. He had seen that color from the ground and from the cockpit. And from the cockpit it was something else entirely. From 37,000 feet, that blue became something so vast and so still that it never failed to remind him why he had wanted to fly in the first place. He dressed quietly in the dark slacks, pressed the night before, and hung on the back of the bathroom door. A clean white button-down shirt, the collar crisp, the cuffs folded back twice with the automatic precision of a man who had done it 10,000 times. He didn't wear his uniform on deadhead flights. When captains travel as passengers to reach their next assignment, they flew in civilian clothes, invisible among the paying customers. He had always found a particular irony in that. In uniform, no one ever questioned him. Out of uniform, on his own airline, with his own boarding pass and his own employee credentials, he became something else entirely in people's eyes, something that required explanation. He had learned to carry that irony the way he carried everything else, quietly, without complaint, with a patience that had been earned, not given. In the kitchen, the coffee maker had already started. He set the timer every night before bed. He poured a cup, black, no sugar, and stood at the window drinking it slowly while the city gradually brightened around him. He was not a man who rushed mornings. Rushing mornings was how you arrived at the day already behind it. His father had taught him that to. His father, James Washington, the man who had worked 31 years loading cargo at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, who had pressed Marcus's model planes with the same careful hands that pressed his work shirts, who had driven him to the public library every Saturday morning from the time Marcus was 6 until the time he was 16 and had a bus pass of his own. James Washington, who had never flown on an airplane in his life, who had stood on the tarmac observation deck with his wife on the day Marcus completed his first solo flight and wept in a way that Marcus had never seen before and never saw. Again, Marcus set the coffee cup in the sink and picked up the watch from the kitchen counter where he always placed it the night before. It was a simple watch, not expensive, not flashy. A Seiko automatic with a worn leather strap that had been resoled twice. His father had given it to him on the day Marcus received his commercial pilot's license, pressing it into his palm without ceremony and saying only, "Time is the one thing you can't make more of. Don't waste a second of it on people who can't see what you are, Marcus." fastened it around his wrist, and picked up his bag. He had a flight to catch. Hartsfield-Jackson was already moving by the time Marcus arrived at 6:15 a.m. The terminal hummed with the particular energy of early morning travel. The coffee shops already lines deep. The gate agents setting up their stations. The cleaning crews finishing their overnight rounds. Marcus moved through the space with the ease of someone who had spent a significant portion of his adult life in airports. He knew the rhythms of this place the way a musician knows a familiar song, not by thinking about it, but by having absorbed it so completely that navigation became automatic. He checked in at the Meridian Airlines counter without incident. The agent, a young woman named Stephanie, according to her badge, who couldn't have been more than 23, processed his deadhead travel request efficiently, printed his boarding pass for seat 3A in first class, and handed it across the counter with a professional smile. "Have a good flight, Mr. Washington," she said. He thanked her and moved towards security. Through the TSA checkpoint, down the long corridor of Concourse T, past the Hudson News and the Chick-fil-A that always had a line regardless of the hour, to gate T14 where flight 2247 to Seattle was boarding in approximately 90 minutes. He found a seat in the gate area near the window, always near the window, always with a view of the aircraft, and settled in with the remaining half of his coffee from the terminal Starbucks and the paperback he had been slowly working through. For the past 2 weeks, he read 3 pages. Then he set the book down and looked out at the plane. It was a Boeing 737-900R, tail number N for 7MR. He knew this aircraft. He had flown this specific tail number twice before, once on a Dallas run 18 months ago, once on a red-eye to JFK the previous spring. It was a solid airplane, well-maintained, the kind of machine that inspired confidence in people who understood what they were looking at. Marcus understood exactly what he was looking at. He picked up his book again and waited. Around him, the gate area filled gradually. Business travelers with roller bags and laptop cases. A family with 3 children under the age of 8, the youngest asleep against her mother's shoulder. An elderly couple sharing a newspaper, each reading their half without exchanging a word in the comfortable silence of people who have been together so long that silence has become its own language. A group of college students heading home for a break, loud and loose and entirely unconcerned with anyone around them. Marcus watched them all with the quiet attention that had become second nature to him. After 14 years of watching passengers board his aircraft, watching the nervous ones and the confident ones, the first-time flyers and the road warriors, the grief-stricken and the joyful, he had developed an almost involuntary awareness of the human landscape around him. He noticed things. He always had. What he noticed now, as boarding began and he joined the line for first class, was the way the gate agent, a woman in her mid-30s with her hair pulled back severely and a name tag that read Jennifer, looked at him as he approached the podium. It was a look he recognized. He had seen it enough times to know exactly what it meant and exactly what was likely to follow. He handed her his boarding pass. He smiled, because his mother had raised him to be polite and because his father had taught him that dignity did not require rudeness even when rudeness was what you were receiving. Jennifer scanned the pass. She looked at her screen. She looked at him. She looked at her screen again. "Go ahead," she said finally. And Marcus walked down the jetway toward the aircraft. He found 3A without assistance, stowed his bag in the overhead compartment, and settled into the window seat. The leather was good. The legroom was generous. Outside, the morning sun was beginning to clear the horizon, throwing long gold light across the tarmac and the nose of the aircraft. Marcus fastened his seatbelt, opened his book, and thought about Seattle. He had 17 minutes before Jennifer Holloway walked down the aisle and changed the shape of the morning. Jennifer Holloway had worked for Meridian Airlines for 6 years, 2 months, and approximately 14 days. She knew this not because she counted, but because the anniversary had passed recently, and a colleague had mentioned it over break-room coffee with the particular mix of congratulation and sympathy that marked airline employment milestones. 6 years was a long time in this job, long enough to have seen things, long enough to have developed opinions. She had started as a gate agent straight out of a hospitality management program at a college in suburban Ohio, one of those institutions that existed primarily to produce the kind of employees who could smile under pressure and manage difficult people with professional smoothness. Jennifer had excelled at both. She was organized, quick-thinking, and possessed of a near-photographic memory for gate information, boarding procedures, and passenger manifests. She had been promoted to senior gate agent after 4 years. Her performance reviews were consistently strong. What her performance reviews did not capture, what no performance review ever captures, was the architecture of assumptions that Jennifer Holloway had built up over 6 years of working in airport gate. She had processed tens of thousands of passengers in that time. She had developed, as all people do in jobs that require rapid human assessment, a set of shortcuts, categories, expectations. She knew, for instance, what a first-class passenger looked like. She knew it not from any policy or training document, but from pattern recognition accumulated over years. First-class passengers looked a certain way, carried themselves a certain way, wore their entitlement with a specific kind of ease. She knew what belonged and what didn't, or she thought she did. The problem with shortcuts is that they are shortcuts. They cut corners, and corners, when cut in the wrong places, leave gaps where the truth can fall through unnoticed. Jennifer had noticed the man in 3A when he boarded. She had scanned his pass and let him through, but something had snagged in the back of her mind. A small, quiet wrongness that she couldn't immediately name. She had finished processing the remaining first-class passengers and had been about to move on to main cabin boarding when the message arrived. It came from the gate podium system, an internal flag, the kind that could be triggered by passenger complaints submitted through the airline's mobile app. She read it quickly. A passenger in 3B had reported feeling uncomfortable with the current seating situation in first class and had requested intervention from gate staff. Jennifer read the message twice. She looked down the jetway. She made a decision that she would spend considerable time afterward trying to justify to herself, to her supervisor, to the airline's HR department, and in the quietest hours of subsequent nights, to herself again. She walked down the jetway and onto the aircraft. The first-class cabin was nearly full. Most passengers were already in their seats, settling in, accepting pre-departure beverages from the flight attendant Rosa, who was working the forward galley with the efficient warmth she brought to every flight. Jennifer moved down the aisle with deliberate professionalism, her expression pleasant, her purpose hidden behind the mask of routine. She stopped at row 3. The man in 3A was reading a paperback. He looked up when she stopped beside him with the unhurried ease of someone who is not startled, because they have nothing to be startled about. "Excuse me, sir," Jennifer said. "Can I see your boarding pass?" He looked at her for a moment, just a moment, a beat too brief to be called a pause, and then reached into his shirt pocket and produced the pass. He handed it to her without a word. She took it, studied it. The boarding pass was valid. The seat assignment was correct. The name matched the manifest. There was nothing wrong with the boarding pass. She handed it back. "There seems to be an error with this seat assignment," she said. The words came out smoothly, professionally, the way trained responses always do, before the thinking part of the brain has time to review them. "I'm going to need you to come with me." "What kind of error?" he asked. His voice was quiet, not aggressive, not frightened, simply direct. "Sir, this seat is reserved for our premium members, and I have a first-class boarding pass," he said, "issued by this airline, at that counter, 40 minutes ago. I understand that, sir, but I've had a complaint from another passenger, and I need to sort this out at the gate." There it was, out in the open now, a complaint from another passenger. Jennifer watched his face as she said it and saw something move behind his eyes. Not anger, not shock, but a kind of recognition, the specific recognition of a person who has encountered this particular species of situation before and knows its contours by heart. "A complaint," he said. "Not a question, if you'll please." "Come with me," Jennifer said. He didn't move immediately. He looked at her with those quiet, steady eyes for 3 full seconds. Jennifer had the uncomfortable experience of feeling assessed, not threatened, not challenged, but seen, in a way that made her suddenly, acutely aware of herself and of what she was doing. Then he stood up. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand to know who had complained or why. Didn't invoke his rights or his ticket price or any of the weapons that passengers in this situation typically reach for. He simply closed his book, took his bag from the overhead compartment, and walked up the aisle ahead of her. The cabin had gone quiet. Jennifer could feel it, that specific, charged silence of a shared space in which everyone has registered that something is wrong, but no one has said so. She could see phones being raised in her peripheral vision. She kept her eyes forward and followed the man off the aircraft on the jetway. Walking back toward the gate, Jennifer had her first full moment of doubt. It arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a small, cold tightening in her chest. She looked at the back of the man ahead of her, his posture, the set of his shoulders, the measured cadence of his walk, and thought, for the first time since she had read the complaint notification, that she might have made a mistake. She did not say this. She continued walking. At the gate, Paul Garrett was waiting. Paul Garrett was the kind of supervisor who had achieved his position primarily through tenure. In the absence of catastrophic failure, he was 51 years old, had been with Meridian for 19 years, and had developed over that time the particular institutional confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong in a context that mattered. He crossed his arms as the man approached, a gesture so practiced it had become automatic, and prepared to manage the situation. He did not know, as he stood there with his arms crossed and his tablet in hand, that he was approximately 90 seconds away from the worst professional moment of his 19-year career. Mr. He glanced at the tablet. Washington, I apologize for the inconvenience. It appears there may have been an overbooked situation in the first-class cabin. There wasn't. The man said. Paul blinked. Sir, I understand I'm not frustrated, the man said. And the extraordinary thing was that he wasn't. His voice was completely level. I'm listening. Tell me what you believe happened. Paul had processed thousands of passenger complaints. He had never had one respond this way. The calmness was disorienting in the way that an unexpected silence can be. Disorienting, your body prepares for a sound that doesn't come in the absence of it throws you. We'll need to rebook you an economy for this flight, Paul said, recovering. We can offer you a travel voucher for the difference in. I need to be in Seattle by 0900. The man said, I have a crew waiting. Paul paused. A crew? Yes. The man reached into his jacket. Slowly, deliberately, without drama, he produced something from his inside pocket and placed it on the counter between them. Paul Garrett looked down at the counter. Jennifer, standing 2 feet to his left, looked at the counter. The gate agent at the adjacent desk, who had been making a determined effort not to listen, stopped making that effort entirely. On the counter lay a Meridian Airlines captain's identification card, wings, a photograph, a full name, rank, and employee number. Captain Marcus Washington. Employee ID 04471. 14 years of service. Current assignment, Seattle Hub, Flight Operations Division. The silence that followed lasted for seconds. It felt, to everyone present, significantly longer. Paul Garrett picked up the ID with both hands. This was not a conscious decision. His hands simply moved toward it the way hands move towards something that the brain needs to examine more closely before it can accept what the eyes are reporting. He turned it over. The car was real. He could see that immediately. The holographic security features, the employee barcode, the department seal. He had seen enough Meridian credentials in 19 years to know a genuine one from a forgery. And this was as genuine as they came. He looked at the photograph on the card. He looked at the man standing across the counter. He looked at the photograph again. They match. Of course they matched. Paul started, and then stopped. Because completing that sentence required acknowledging something that he was not yet fully prepared to acknowledge. Captain Washington, the man said, with the patient, measured tone of someone who has explained something before and is willing to explain it again, but would prefer not to have to. I'm deadheading to Seattle to take command of Flight 247. Departure is scheduled for 0830, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the same aircraft you just had me removed from." Paul set the ID down on the counter. His mind was running very fast through a number of calculations, all of them arriving at the same destination, which was a destination he did not want to be at. He thought about the complaint, the passenger in 3B who had reported feeling uncomfortable with the seating arrangement. He thought about Jennifer walking down the jetway. He thought about his decision to have the passenger removed, without conducting any verification of identity, without reviewing the boarding records, without following any of the procedures that existed precisely to prevent situations like this one. He thought about the phones being raised in the first-class cabin, about the people watching, the passenger who complained, Captain Washington said. His voice had not changed in tone or volume. It remained exactly as it had been throughout this entire exchange, quiet, direct, and utterly without performance. What exactly did they say? Paul looked down at his tablet. The text of the complaint was still on the screen. He read it again, and the words that had seemed like a reasonable trigger for action 20 minutes ago now sat on the screen with a different quality entirely. Uncomfortable with the seating arrangement. That was all. No specific complaint. No incident described. Just discomfort with an arrangement. They said they felt uncomfortable, Paul said. His voice was quieter now. With the seating arrangement, Captain Washington nodded slowly. It was a single, deliberate nod, the kind that means, "I understand exactly what you are telling me, and I understand exactly what you are not saying. I see," he said. He did not demand an apology. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten legal action or regulatory complaints or media exposure, all of which were tools readily available to a man in his position, and all of which, in this moment, he chose not to reach for. He reached instead for the ID on the counter, picked it up, and returned it to his jacket pocket with the same unhurried deliberateness with which he had placed it there. Then he looked at Paul Garrett with the full, undiminished weight of 14 years and 11,000 hours and a career built on the willingness to show up completely every single day in a world that had consistently asked him to prove himself before it would make space for him. "I'd like to board now," Captain Washington said. Paul nodded. His voice, when it came, was smaller than usual. "Of course, Captain. Of course." He turned to Jennifer. "Please escort Captain Washington back to his seat." Jennifer opened her mouth. The process of opening her mouth was automatic. What was not automatic, what, in fact, was completely impossible, was finding words to put into it. She closed it again. Captain Washington turned and walked back down the jetway. Jennifer stood at the gate podium and watched him go, and felt something she would not fully name until much later that night, sitting alone in the parking structure of the airport waiting for a ride share that she had called far too early, because she couldn't make herself stay in the break room with her colleagues who had witnessed the whole thing. What she felt was not quite shame. It was something more complicated than shame. It was the specific and deeply uncomfortable sensation of having been shown something true about yourself that you had managed, until that moment, not to see. Inside the aircraft, Captain Washington walked back down the aisle of the first-class cabin. He did not hurry. He did not look at the other passengers. He moved down the aisle with the same measured, unhurried bearing with which he did everything, and he returned to seat 3A. And he placed his bag in the overhead compartment, and he sat down, and he fastened his seat belt. The cabin was completely silent. Word had traveled, as it always does in enclosed spaces, with the speed and totality of a rumor in a small town. The flight attendant Rosa had heard fragments of the conversation on the jetway. Through the open forward door, she had said something quietly to her colleague. Her colleague had said something quietly to the passenger in to be. The passenger in to be had turned to look at the gate, and then turned back, and by the time Captain Washington settled into his seat, every person in the first-class cabin had a version of the story. The woman in 4A who had whispered to her husband when Captain Washington was first removed now looked very carefully at the tray table in front of her. The man in 3C, adjusted his headphones, and fixed his gaze on the seat back screen with an attention so intense and so sudden that it was clearly manufactured. The passenger in 3B, the window seat across the aisle, the one whose complaint had set everything in motion, did not look up at all, kept their eyes on their phone, held the phone at a slight angle, in the way that people hold phones when they are using them as a barrier against something they don't want to confront. Rosa appeared beside Captain Washington's seat within 30 seconds of him sitting down. She was a woman in her mid-40s who had been flying with Meridian for 9 years and who had, over those 9 years, developed a finely calibrated sense of when a situation required her full attention and when it required her full restraint. This situation required both. "Can I get you anything, Captain?" she asked. Her voice was professional. Her eyes were apologetic in the way that eyes become when a person has stayed quiet in a moment that required speaking and is carrying the weight of that silence. "Water," Captain Washington said. "Thank you, Rosa." She nodded and returned to the galley. Captain Washington looked out the window. The morning sun was fully up now, flooding the tarmac in clean gold light. He watched the ground crew finish their pre-departure checks on the nose landing gear. He watched a fueled truck pull away. He watched the ordinary choreography of an airport morning that he had watched from cockpits, and from gates, and from this exact angle, the passenger's angle, the civilian angle, the angle of a man who is trusted with the sky but not always trusted on the ground. He thought about his father standing on the observation deck at Hartsfield-Jackson in the summer heat, watching a small plane make 3 loops and a landing, weeping without embarrassment because his son was in that plane and his son had just done something that no one in their family had ever done before. He thought about what his father had said to him later, in the car on the way home, with the late afternoon sun on the dashboard and the radio turned low. "They're going to make you prove yourself twice, Marcus. Maybe 3 times. You prove it every time. Not because they deserve the proof, because you deserve to know you gave it." Marcus had not fully understood that at 22. He understood it completely now. He opened his book. He had 7 pages left in the chapter, and he intended to finish it before they reached cruising altitude. The boarding door closed at 8:24 a.m., 6 minutes ahead of schedule. Rosa made the final count, 212 passengers, every seat filled, first class, economy comfort, and main cabin, and gave the thumbs up to her colleague at the aft door. Captain Washington drank the last of his water, tucked the empty cup into the seat pocket, and returned to his book. He finished the chapter as the aircraft pushed back from the gate. In the cockpit, 2 men were running through their pre-flight checklists who did not know, and would not find out until after landing, what had happened in the first-class cabin 40 minutes earlier. First Officer David Chen, 29 years old and 18 months into his career with Meridian, was working his way through the approach and departure briefing with the focused energy of a young pilot who takes nothing for granted. Captain James Holloman, no relation to Jennifer, who had 40 years in aviation and had long since achieved the particular serenity of a man who had seen everything the sky could throw and had developed a comfortable relationship with all of it, was cross-checking the fuel figures against the flight plan. Neither of them was thinking about what was happening in the passenger cabin. That was not their concern at this moment. Their concern was the aircraft, and the route and the weather over the Rockies, and the 212 people in the seats behind them who would touch down in Seattle, with no memory of this pre-flight process because that, ultimately, was the goal, to make the extraordinary so ordinary that no one noticed it happening. The pushback was complete. The tug disconnected. The engine spooled up, that deep, rising, authoritative sound that always settled something in Captain Washington's chest. Regardless of where he was sitting when he heard it, he put his book in the seat pocket. He preferred to be present during taxi and take off even when he was a passenger. Old habits. The habits of a man who understood what was happening during those minutes and respected them. Jennifer Holloway was in the break room when the aircraft left the gate. She knew this because she was watching the departure board from where she sat, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, with the specific emptiness of someone who has just used up everything they had on a situation and has nothing left for whatever comes next. Her colleague Dara sat across from her, Dara had been at the adjacent gate when everything happened. She had seen it all. You want to talk about it? Dara asked. Jennifer looked at the departure board. N447MR was listed as departed on time. No, Jennifer said. Dara nodded. She was wise enough to know when no meant no. They sat in silence for a while. The break room hummed with the sounds of an airport morning, distant announcements, the whir of the coffee machine, the muffled percussion of rolling luggage from the quarter outside. He didn't yell. Jennifer said finally. She was not speaking to Dara, exactly. She was speaking to the fact of it. The way you speak to something that keeps presenting itself for examination. No. Dara agreed. He didn't threaten to sue. Didn't call a lawyer. Didn't film it and say he was going to post it. No. He just... Jennifer stopped. She looked at her coffee cup. He just showed his ID and asked to board. Dara didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Jennifer set the coffee down. She thought about the look on his face when she had told him. There was a complaint from another passenger. Not the anger she had expected. Not the wounded pride or the defensive posturing. Just that quiet, recognizing look. The look of a person who has lived inside this particular experience long enough to know its shape. That was the thing she could not stop turning over. Not the embarrassment of being wrong. Not the professional consequences, whatever they would be. The thing she could not stop turning over was the knowledge that this was not new to him. That she was not the first gate Jennifer in 14 years of his career. That the composure he had shown was not composure in the sense of an effort to be composed. It was composure in the sense of a depth that had been reached through repetition. He had been this calm because he had needed to be this calm many times before. He had learned, in the specific school that some people are enrolled in without ever choosing to attend, to carry this weight without setting it down in public. Jennifer picked up her coffee and took a drink. It had gone cold. At 37,000 feet, over eastern Tennessee. Captain Washington was asleep. He had the ability, developed over years of red-eye flights and early departures, and the creative schedule management that aviation requires, to sleep anywhere, at any time, for precisely as long as his body needed. On this flight, it needed 43 minutes. He woke as the aircraft began its descent into the Pacific Northwest, with the instinctive awareness of a man whose body had learned to track altitude and pressure changes even in unconsciousness. He looked out the window. Below, through a break in the cloud layer, he could see the dark green sprawl of the Cascades giving way to the gray-blue shimmer of Puget Sound, the geometry of water and land and cloud that he had always found more beautiful, from above than from any photograph he had ever seen of it. He thought about the passenger in 3B. He thought about it the way he thought about all such things, not with bitterness, which he had found over the years to be a corrosive and ultimately pointless emotion, but with a kind of deliberate, clear-eyed attention. The passenger had been uncomfortable. They had reported that discomfort. They had used the tools available to them to act on it. The discomfort itself, the thing that had caused it, the specific mechanism by which his presence in a first-class seat had become a reportable event. That was the thing worth understanding, not the individual, the pattern, the expectation, the deep, accumulated sediment of assumption that made certain presences feel wrong in certain spaces, without any specific evidence of wrongness. Marcus had spent considerable time in his life thinking about this. He had read about it, talked about it with friends who had their own catalogs of similar experiences, listened to his parents' stories and his grandparents' stories, and understood, at a cellular level, that he was not an isolated case, but a single instance of an ongoing and extensively documented phenomenon. Understanding it did not make it not happen, but it changed what he did with it. He did not carry it as grief. He carried it as information. The aircraft broke through the cloud layer, and Seattle appeared. Below, the Space Needle and the water and the mountains, and the particular gray softness of a Pacific Northwest morning. Captain Washington looked at it and thought that it was beautiful. He thought that he would walk to Pike Place Market before his briefing if he had time. He thought that he would call his mother when he landed. He did not think about C-3B again on that flight, back at the gate in Atlanta. Paul Garrett was on the phone with the airline's legal department. The call had come in from HR first, then from legal. Both of them having received the same package of information, the incident report Paul had filed. A preliminary review of the passenger complaint, and something Paul had not anticipated when he filed his report, the footage. 3 separate passengers in the first-class cabin had recorded portions of the incident on their phones. All 3 recordings showed the same sequence of events. A man in a white button-down shirt, seated in 3A, reading a book. A gate agent stopping beside him and asking for his boarding pass. The man handing it over. The gate agent telling him there was a seating error. The man responding. The man being asked to leave. The man leaving. The recordings did not capture the conversation at the gate podium. They didn't need to. What they captured was sufficient. By 10:30 a.m., the footage was on social media. By noon, it had been shared 40,000 times. By 2 p.m., 3 major news outlets had picked it up. By the time Captain Washington completed his pre-flight walk-around on N447MR's return leg to Atlanta that afternoon, his name had been searched on the internet over 100,000 times. He found this out from David Chen, his first officer on the return flight, who pulled it up on his phone during the crew briefing with the expression of a young man who is not sure whether he's supposed to say something or not. It's all over Twitter, David said, and Instagram, and everywhere else. They're calling it, he hesitated. It's fine, Captain Washington said. What are they calling it? David turned the phone so Marcus could see the screen. The top trending hashtag read, hashtag Captain Washington. Marcus looked at it for a moment. Then he handed the phone back. Let's talk about the weather over the Rockies, he said. The formal investigation began the following morning. Meridian Airlines Internal Affairs Department, a division that existed primarily to process the kind of complaint that no airline wants to receive, which is the kind that makes the news, opened a file on the incident at Atlanta Gate T14 at 9 a.m. sharp. The file was assigned the designation IED for 47 ATL, and it moved through the investigative process with an urgency that was directly proportional to the number of media requests the Communications Department had fielded in the previous 24 hours. Which was substantial. The airline's communications team, a group of 5 people in a corner office on the 4th floor of Meridian's headquarters in Dallas, had been in crisis mode since the footage went viral. Their job in situations like this was containment, get ahead of the narrative, position the airline as responsive and accountable, manage the public face of an institution that was simultaneously trying to be genuinely sorry and legally protected, 2 goals that are in fundamental tension and require considerable professional dexterity to pursue simultaneously. They issued a statement at noon on Wednesday that acknowledged the incident, expressed regret, and committed to a thorough review. The statement did not name Captain Washington by name, a legal decision, and did not name Jennifer Holloway or Paul Garrett. It used the language that corporate statements use, does not reflect our values, commitment to creating a welcoming environment for all, comprehensive review of our procedures. The Internet received this statement with the specific skepticism that the Internet reserves for corporate statements, which is considerable and largely justified. Captain Washington received a phone call from the airline's senior vice president of operations, a man named Richard Hollis, who had been with Meridian for 25 years and who had the specific quality of institutional authority that comes from having survived enough crises to develop a working relationship with them. Marcus Hollis said they had met at company events, knew each other by name if not well. I want to start by saying that what happened was completely unacceptable, and I want you to hear that directly from me before you hear anything from communications. Marcus was in his hotel room in Seattle. He was sitting in the chair by the window, looking out at the water. He had been awake since 5, had gone for a run along the waterfront, and had come back and showered and was on his second coffee of the morning when the call came. I appreciate that, Richard, he said. We're conducting a full investigation. Both the gate agent and the senior agent on duty will be subject to disciplinary review. I want to be direct with you. We take this seriously. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Can I ask you something? Of course. The passenger who filed the complaint, the one in 3B, was there any follow-up on their end? There was a pause. The legal team has been in contact with the passenger. Yes, I'm not asking about legal contact, Marcus said. I'm asking whether anyone from the airline called that person and explained what happened. What the impact was. Another pause, longer. Hollis started. I'd have to check on the specific sequence of outreach, because, Marcus said, his voice still entirely level, I think that conversation matters. Not for legal reasons. For human ones. The gate agent made a decision based on a complaint. The complaint came from a person with a set of assumptions. If we address the gate agent but not the assumptions, we haven't addressed anything. We've just moved the problem. Richard Hollis was quiet for a long time. That's a perspective we need to hear, he said finally. I'd like to include that in the review process, if you're willing. I'm willing, Marcus said. I'll cooperate with whatever the process requires. The investigation took 11 days. Jennifer Holloway was placed on administrative leave pending its conclusion. Paul Garrett received a formal written reprimand, the most severe action available short of termination, and was required to complete a full recertification of his customer service protocols. The passenger in 3B, whose name was never made public, received a personal call from the airline's VP of Customer Experience, a conversation that lasted 40 minutes and that the VP later described, in the internal summary, as difficult and important and necessary. On the 12th day, the investigation produced its formal report. It ran to 47 pages. It concluded that the incident had been caused by a failure at multiple levels, an improperly processed passenger complaint, a failure of verification protocols, and an absence of sufficient bias awareness training for gate staff. It recommended 17 specific procedural changes and mandated a company-wide training program to be completed within 90 days. Marcus received a copy of the executive summary. He read it carefully. Then he sent a response to Richard Hollis with 2 notes. The first, the 17 procedural recommendations were sound and he was glad to see them. The second, procedural change without cultural change was a floor, not a ceiling. He asked whether the airline would be willing to go further, to bring in external expertise, to create a formal advisory structure that included employees from underrepresented groups, to publish annual accountability data. He made the request without ultimatum and without condition. He made it as a person who had spent 14 years inside an institution and knew its capacity for change and its resistance to it. Hollis called him 2 days later. We're going to do it, he said. All of it. I want you to be involved, if you're willing. Marcus said he was. Jennifer Holloway returned from administrative leave on a Tuesday, the same day of the week as the incident, which she noticed with a kind of dark symmetry. She had spent her leave in the way that forced stillness always compels you to spend time, in close proximity to yourself, with limited ability to look away. She had started by trying to defend her decision. The complaint had been real. Her response had followed protocol. She had been professional throughout. These were facts, and they were true, and she had held them in front of her like a shield. For approximately 4 days before the shield stopped working. The shield stopped working when she watched the video. She had avoided it for those 4 days, but eventually she watched it. The way you eventually have to look at a thing you're afraid of, because the not looking becomes its own kind of weight. She watched herself on that video walk down the aisle of the aircraft. She watched herself stop at row 3. She watched herself speak and then watched him hand over his boarding pass, and she watched herself study it, and she watched herself tell him there was an error, and she watched his face in that moment, that specific, recognizing look, and she understood, watching it from the outside, what that look meant in a way she had not understood in the moment. He was not surprised. That was the thing. He was not surprised. She watched the video 3 times, and then she closed her laptop and sat in the quiet of her apartment and thought about that for a long time. She did not decide anything that day. She simply sat with it. But something shifted, in the specific way that things shift when you have finally stopped trying to argue with them. On her first day back, she requested a meeting with her supervisor and the HR representative to discuss, as she put it in the meeting request, what I need to do differently, not what the airline needs to do, not what the training program should cover, what she needed to do differently. The meeting lasted 2 hours. It was the beginning of something that would take considerably longer. James Washington was 73 years old and had lived in the same house in southwest Atlanta for 41 years. It was a 3-bedroom ranch house on a quiet street lined with oak trees that had been planted before he moved in and had grown, over the decades of his residency, into something substantial and shade-giving and permanent feeling. He had raised 2 children in that house, had buried his wife of 47 years from that house 3 years ago, had sat on the porch of that house through more summer evenings than he could count, watching the neighborhood change and stay the same in the ways that neighborhoods do. He found out about the incident the same way most people his age found out about things. From his daughter, Marcus's younger sister Diane, who called him on a Wednesday morning sounding excited in the way she got when something important had happened. "Daddy, have you seen the news about Marcus?" She said. He had not. He turned on the television. He watched the footage 3 times while Diane stayed on the line and explained what had happened. Then he asked her to hold on, set the phone down on the coffee table, and sat in the quiet for a moment. Outside the window, one of the oaks was doing what oaks do in the late morning, standing enormously still and entirely itself, indifferent to everything around it. James looked at it. He thought about the day he had given Marcus the watch. He thought about what he had said in the car on the way home from the airfield. He picked up the phone. He handled it right. James said, "I know, Daddy. Did he call you?" "Last night. He sounded fine." "He would sound fine," James said. "That's the thing about your brother. He sounds fine because he is fine, not because nothing happened, because he's built in a way that makes him fine anyway." Diane was quiet for a moment. "It shouldn't have happened." "No," James agreed. "It shouldn't have." He looked at the television, which was now showing a news anchor discussing the incident with a panel of commentators, who were saying various things with various degrees of heat and illumination. "You know what I keep thinking about?" James said. "What?" "That first solo flight. I watched him land that plane. He was 22 years old. He was the only black kid in his training cohort. Did you know that?" "Yes." "He never made a big thing of it. Just showed up every day. Just did the work. That landing he made that day." James paused. "I've seen a lot of things in my life, Diane. That landing is still one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. Not because it was technically perfect, though it was. Because of what it meant. Because of what he had to be, internally, to get to that runway." Diane didn't say anything. She could hear something in her father's voice that she recognized, that specific quality that arrived when James Washington was feeling something profound enough to slow his speech down. "He's going to be fine," James said. "He's always been fine. That's not the question." "What's the question?" James looked at the oak tree outside his window. "The question is whether the world gets fine too. Eventually." He called Marcus that evening. Marcus was back in Atlanta, home between assignments, and answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, son. How are you?" "Good. Tired, but good. Your sister told me." "I figured. I watched the video." A brief silence. "Yeah, you handled it exactly right," James said. "I know," Marcus said. And then, after a moment, "It still takes something out of you, Dad, even when you handle it right. It still costs something." James nodded at the phone. "I know it does," he said quietly. "I know it does." They were quiet together for a moment. The particular quiet of 2 men who understand each other so completely that silence is not empty, but full. "How's the watch?" James asked. Marcus laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes without effort. "It's good. Keeps perfect time. They always do," James said. "The good ones always do." After they hung up, James Washington sat on his porch in the warm Atlanta evening and watched the light fade out of the sky. He thought about his son flying through that same sky at 37,000 feet. Hands on a yoke, voice calm on the radio, 200 people behind him trusting him with their lives without knowing his name. He thought about all the years of proving, all the days of showing up, all the times the world had asked Marcus to be not just good but undeniably, unignorably good, to be so clearly excellent that the space around him could no longer maintain the pressure of its own assumptions? He thought about how exhausting that was. He thought about how Marcus had done it anyway. He thought about how Marcus would keep doing it. He thought about the oak trees in his front yard, planted decades ago by someone he never knew, grown now into something that no one could overlook or question or ask to prove itself. Just there, enormous and real and settled into the earth. You plant things, James thought, and you tend them, and eventually they grow into something that can't be ignored. He sat on his porch until the stars came out. Then he went inside and went to bed and slept the sleep of a man at peace with what he had raised. Blum 7 Sonic and Massage approximately 8.00 characters 6 weeks after the incident at Gate T14. Meridian Airlines held its first company-wide bias awareness training session. The program had been developed in partnership with 3 external organizations: a civil rights law firm, an aviation industry diversity consultancy, and an academic research group that specialized in implicit bias. In high-stakes professional environments, it was delivered to all customer-facing staff across the airline's 17 hub cities simultaneously, via a combination of in-person facilitation and digital participation. Captain Marcus Washington was one of the session's featured speakers. He had agreed to participate not because the airline asked him to. They had. And he would have found a polite way to decline if he had wanted to, but because he had thought carefully about what use he could make of the experience and had concluded that this was it. He stood at a podium in a conference room at Meridian's Atlanta training facility and looked out at an audience of approximately 200 gate agents, flight attendants, ground crew supervisors, and customer service leads. All of them had seen the footage. Most of them had an opinion about it. Some of them, he knew, had experiences similar to his own. Others had, without perhaps being fully aware of it, been on the other side of those experiences. He did not lecture. He had never been comfortable with lectures. He told them what had happened, not the incident, which they all knew, but the experience of it, what it felt like to stand at that gate counter, what it cost to remain calm in a situation where calm required more energy than anger would have, what it meant to reach into his jacket and produce his ID, to have to prove, once again, that he belonged in the space he was standing in. He told them about the first time it happened to him. He was 24, a regional first officer flying short hops up and down the East Coast for a carrier that no longer existed. He had been in uniform. He had been stopped by airport security in an employee quarter and asked for his ID. Despite the fact that his ID was visible on his chest, the security guard had apologized afterward, a quick, embarrassed apology. The kind that is more about the apologizer's discomfort than the recipient's. Marcus had thanked him and walked on. He had been thanking people and walking on for 17 years. "I'm not here to assign guilt," Marcus told the room. "I'm here because I think the people in this room are capable of something that the people who build the systems you work in didn't always manage, which is honest examination, looking at the assumptions you carry, understanding where they come from, understanding what they cost, not just the person on the receiving end, but the airline, the institution, and ultimately yourself." He paused. "The gate agent who asked me to leave was not, I believe, a bad person. I've thought about this a lot. I think she was a person with a set of assumptions that her experience had confirmed often enough, that she had stopped questioning them. And I think the problem isn't really about her. The problem is the world in which those assumptions feel like common sense. Our job, all of our jobs, is to build something different. Not perfectly, not all at once, but differently." The room was very quiet. "I've been flying for 14 years, Marcus said. "I plan to fly for at least 14 more, and I intend to spend those 14 years doing the same thing I've always done, which is showing up and doing the work. But I also intend to spend them saying what I'm saying right now, in rooms like this one, because the sky is big enough for all of us, and it's past time the ground caught up." He stepped back from the podium. The applause started slowly and built. In the third row, Jennifer Holloway put her hands together and kept them together for a long time. In the weeks that followed, the 17 procedural changes recommended by the investigation were implemented across all Meridian hubs. The company published its first annual Diversity and Inclusion Accountability Report, something Marcus had specifically requested and Hollis had agreed to. The passenger complaint system was redesigned to require supervisor review before any action was taken in response to a complaint about a fellow passenger's presence. Small changes, incremental changes, the kind of changes that look modest from the outside and matter enormously to the people inside them. Captain Marcus Washington returned to full flight duty the week after the training session. His first assignment was a morning flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles, 6 hours, full aircraft. Clear weather forecast all the way to the coast. He arrived at the crew briefing at 5:30 a.m. He walked through the pre-flight with David Chen, who had become his regular first officer on the Atlanta hub and who had, in the weeks since the incident, developed a specific admiration for Marcus. That comes from watching someone handle an impossible situation with perfect grace. They completed the walk around together. The aircraft was clean. The systems checked out. The fuel was loaded. The weather was exactly as forecast. At 7:15 a.m., the boarding door opened and the passengers began to file in. Marcus stood at the cockpit door for a moment. It was something he did occasionally, when the schedule allowed, a small gesture of presence, and watched them come aboard. The business travelers and the families, the nervous first-timers and the seasoned road warriors, the people who looked up and the people who didn't. He caught the eye of a small boy, maybe 7 years old, being shepherded down the aisle by his mother. The boy was looking at the cockpit with the specific, wide-eyed wonder of a child who has not yet learned to pretend that this is ordinary. Marcus smiled at him. The boy's eyes went wide. Then he smiled back, a smile so complete and unguarded that it arrived like a small warm light. Marcus stepped back into the cockpit. He put on his headset. He settled into the left seat. He looked out through the windshield at the long runway ahead of them, at the morning sky beyond the runway, at the particular blue that comes just before the sun is fully up. That color he had loved since the first time he saw it from this altitude, and loved still, 14 years later, every single morning. David ran through the final checklist items. Marcus responded to each one with the measured cadence of absolute familiarity. Altimeter set. Flight controls checked. Takeoff data confirmed. He keyed the radio. Atlanta departure. Meridian 1147, ready for takeoff. Are you in WAY to 6L? Meridian 1147, Atlanta departure. Winds to 170 at 8. Clear for takeoff. Runway to 6L. Marcus advanced the thrust levers. The engines answered immediately, that deep, building roar that never entirely lost its quality of something magnificent, something that had required enormous human effort and ingenuity and ambition to make possible. The aircraft accelerated down the runway. The numbers on the airspeed indicator climbed. At 145 knots, Marcus eased back on the yoke, and the nose lifted. And then the main gear lifted, and then they were airborne. That specific, irreducible moment when the earth releases you and the sky accepts you, which Marcus had experienced thousands of times and which still, every time, felt like what it was, a miracle that had been earned. He raised the gear. He called for flaps up. He banked gently to the left on the departure heading and climbed through the cloud layer into the blue above it, and the city of Atlanta fell away beneath them, and the Appalachians appeared on the horizon to the northeast, and ahead of them was Los Angeles and the Pacific and the whole enormous, indifferent, endlessly beautiful sky. Captain Marcus Washington leveled off at flight level 370, set the autopilot, and looked out at it all. He was exactly where he belonged. He had always been. If Captain Washington's story stayed with you, share it, and tell us in the comments, have you ever been judged before anyone knew who you really were? What did you do? Subscribe for more stories about the people the world underestimates. We'll be here.